Good morning, everyone. I hope this webinar finds you well on this typical autumn day in Brussels. This is where we are. The gray skies, the gentle rain, and that familiar chill in the air. It's the usual Brussels autumn, and we trust no matter where you are joining us from, you are having a wonderful start to this beautiful season. Today, we extend our warmest welcome to all of you as we gather for the webinar titled Insights from the Philanthropy Environment in Europe. So this event is co-hosted by Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and Philea, Philanthropy Europe Association. And we are thrilled to have you with us. My name is Sevda Kılçat. I'm Head of Research and Knowledge Development at Philea. I'm also delighted to say that I am an alumna of Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. So on a more personal note, moderating this webinar and contributing to collaboration between these two organizations is a real privilege for me. The focal point of our discussion today is the latest findings from the Philanthropy Environment in Europe. This is a report that we had the pleasure of releasing jointly in December 2022. And the report not only offers valuable insights, but also places into context two essential publications. One is Philea's comparative highlights of foundation law, and the second is the Lilly's 2022 Global Philanthropy Environment Index. So together, these resources provide comprehensive insights into the current state of philanthropy in Europe and beyond. Well, the notion that an enabling environment is essential for Europe, for philanthropy to thrive, I think is widely acknowledged by everyone in this virtual room. However, I feel like it's crucial to underscore this point as it sets the stage for our discussion today. So the idea is quite simple, but fundamental also. Philanthropy and foundations in particular can be even more effective in their vital work when they operate in an enabling environment. While in a global context, the European philanthropic landscape may appear relatively stable, the recent years have reminded us that even within Europe, we cannot take this stability for granted. So the challenges we face include new restrictions imposed on philanthropic and civic space, concerns surrounding the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights. Additionally, we need a proactive agenda that broadens our tool set, accounting for a more extensive social economy framework to respond effectively to the green, digital, and social transitions that take place around us. So what role does data play in all of this? We believe that we require a dual perspective here. One that provides an analysis of how social, cultural environment, social, cultural, and political environment affect philanthropy, and another that dives into the legal aspects of governing philanthropic operations. So this data is not only for increasing our understanding, but also for shaping national level or EU level policy and advocacy efforts. Therefore, we hope that the resources we will be talking about today will offer you an easy, accessible information about philanthropic landscape in Europe and will equip both national and European philanthropic sectors to advocate more effectively for a favorable operating environment. So throughout this webinar, we will engage in interactive discussions with experts from both of the publications we mentioned earlier. We have a distinguished panel with us today. It's composed of both seasoned researchers and philanthropy practitioners. So allow me to introduce them briefly now. Dr. Oonagh Breen, Professor of Law and Director of Research at University College Dublin. Julia Kuluczenska, lawyer and advocacy expert at Polish Donors Forum. Dr. Isabel Peñalosa, Director of Institutional Relations and Legal Affairs at the Association of Spanish Foundations, and Dr. Pamela Whitking, Family Chair in International Philanthropy at Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and Professor of Societal Significance of Charity Lotteries at Center of Philanthropic Universities at VU Amsterdam. And my dear colleague Hanna Surmats, Head of Policy at Philea. So I would like to first invite Dr. Pamela Whitking. So the second edition of Global Philanthropic Environmental Index was conducted by Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. So can you share some of the key insights for European countries? So what have been the regulatory or political, economic, and social cultural incentives or barriers to philanthropy in European countries? And I also wonder if there have been any changes from the previous period. It's over to you.
Thanks so much, Septa, for this introduction. And I want to thank you all for being here, my fellow panelists, and everyone in the audience. And I want to share with you that you can ask any question you have during this webinar in the Q&A. So please don't wait until the end. Just start writing those questions. Now, please let me share my screen with you so I can show my presentation. Can everyone see this correctly? Yes? Okay, perfect. So today I will be sharing some key insights for European countries from the Global Philanthropy Environment Index 2022, conducted by many of my lovely colleagues at the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. I am part of the supervisory board of this index, but I actually am not involved in doing all that massive work that goes into creating those indices. And I'm very grateful for my colleagues for doing all that work. So the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, first of all, provides comprehensive open access information about the philanthropic environment in economies at every level of income and growth. It identifies incentives and barriers to philanthropy with contributions of more than 100 country-based experts around the world. And thirdly, it offers a framework to better understand how philanthropy is likely to evolve and how it could be enabled to thrive across different geographic regions and cultures. And that really aligns with my personal mission in my research, where I want to help to create more generous societies where people want to contribute to the public good rather than take from it. The 2002 index measures 6 factors that influence the environment for philanthropy: the ease of operating a philanthropic organization, tax incentives, cross-border philanthropic flows, political environment, the economic environment, and the social-cultural environment. Some key research questions that Global Philanthropy Environment Index can help answering are: what are the regulatory, political, economic, and social-cultural incentives and barriers to philanthropy in European countries from 2018 to 2020? That is the period that is covered in the 2022 index. And another really interesting and relevant question is: did the enabling environment for philanthropy change from the previous period the index covered between 2014 and 2017? And if yes, how? In the 8 minutes I have today, I will try to provide an answer to these questions as much as I can. But first, I want to take a step back. At the macro level, the past 10 years, a lot has happened in the philanthropic landscape, and much of this has not been beneficial for philanthropy and civil society. Across the world, there are current developments where governments use laws and regulations to limit the freedom of civil society organizations who work to create a better world. Think, for example, about the 2017 Civil Code in Hungary, implemented by the right-wing government. Under this law, organizations striving to improve society faced great administrative and legal burdens, including funding restrictions for organizations critical of the government. Similar trends can be observed in Poland, Turkey, Russia, India, China, Egypt, Uganda, and unfortunately many more countries. Research shows that often this shrinking space for civil society does not happen overnight, with the exception of Turkey, which experienced a change to a significant restrictive environment in 2010. But rather there appears to be a gradual decline in the civil society space. The space for civil society is especially shrinking in authoritarian regimes and countries termed flawed democracies. So, back to the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, what can we learn from this? So first, when we look at the Global Philanthropy Environment Index 22 in Europe, we see that between 2018 and 2020, experts indicated that European countries typically had favorable environments for philanthropy compared with the global averages. The average overall score on the Global Philanthropy Environment Index in Europe was just over 4 out of a maximum score of 5. Globally, this score is 3.6. On each of the 6 factors measured in the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, European countries appear to have a more favorable environment than globally. But of course, within Europe, there are differences. When we look at the European map, predominantly countries in Western and Northern Europe had an overall philanthropic score of over 4.5 out of 5, indicating a favorable environment for philanthropy. Countries in the Balkan and Central Europe had a score between 3.5 and 4 out of 5, indicating some issues with the philanthropic environment. And countries with a score below 3.5, which have more serious issues with the philanthropic environment, were Albania, Hungary, and Portugal. Now let's look at the changes in the philanthropic environment between 2014 and 17 and 2018 and 2020. Here we see that 43% of the 28 countries we have comparative data for had a relatively stable philanthropic environment. Many of the stable countries are in Western Europe, but also in the Balkan, where countries kept similar but relatively low scores. We also see that 25% of the countries experienced an improvement in their observed philanthropic environment. Countries that improved their score are located in Central Europe, Northern Europe, and Kosovo in the Balkan, which increased its score strongest of all countries in Europe, mostly due to improved tax and cross-border giving facilities. 30% of the countries experienced a decline in their philanthropic environment. These declines are seen all across Europe, and they're quite worrisome. The declines are most pronounced in Southern Europe, where Italy, Portugal, and Spain all experienced an observed decrease in the philanthropic environment for different reasons. Portugal experienced a decrease of most factors measured except for the political environment, which improved. In Spain, the decline is mostly due to tax facilities and cross-border flows. And also in Italy, the cross-border flows declined, but also the political and economic environment worsened. In Central Europe, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland experienced a decrease, partly due to the expected changes in the political environment, which were already problematic in 2018. Their declines are also related to the ease of operating a philanthropic organization, which are no doubt a consequence of the political shrinking space for philanthropy in these countries. I'm very happy we're joined today also by Julia Kluczycka from Poland, who no doubt can share more about the situation in Poland. Finally, since we see that a decrease in the philanthropic environment often relates to a decline in the political environment for philanthropy, I want to show these changes for Europe. In this last figure, we see that 32% of the European countries had a stable political environment, and not less than 39% experienced an increase in how favorable their environment is. The countries that experienced a declining political environment for philanthropy were located in Central and Southern Europe, especially around the Balkans. These countries include Italy, Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia. Poland, interestingly, did not experience a decline in the political environment, but had worrisome scores in both periods, both times a 2.5 out of score of 5. Some reasons for these declining political environments are a more fragile or even hostile relationship between governments and philanthropic organizations, and a decrease in public funding for philanthropic organizations due to COVID-19, or governments cutting funding specifically for critical and diversity-oriented philanthropic organizations, which was the case in Austria. I think the changes in the political environment scores are particularly relevant, as they help predict the direction of the philanthropic environment of a country in the near future. If a political environment is not very conducive for philanthropy, and especially when it worsens over time, it can be expected that other factors of the philanthropic environment will also suffer and potentially lead to more restrictive environments for philanthropy and possibly even more shrinking spaces. We hope that the Global Philanthropy Environment Index can also be useful to you in gaining more in-depth understanding into the philanthropic environment in Europe and changes in this environment over time. Our Global Indices website, you can find much more information, including the 3 reports shared here, and all data is open access. And finally, a massive thank you to everyone for listening and to our funders for supporting our work. I'd like to turn it back now to Septa.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. So the study shows that the socio-cultural environment for philanthropy remained stable during the period of 2018 and 2020. So the general desire to participate in philanthropy is generally well established in Europe. It remains to be seen how the war in Ukraine or energy crisis and other developments will impact this. So let's now move to the second study, Philea 2022 Comparative Highlights. Hanna Surmats, can you tell us what methodology was used in this study, what key trends were identified, and what was the logic to use this joint briefing, and how does this contribute to Philea's policy work? It's over to you.
Thank you so much, Sevda, and thank you so much, Pamela, for your very insightful kickstart of our joint webinar. We are very, very happy to collaborate with the Lilly Family School on this matter, since we believe that our policy work needs to be evidence-based. Hence, we have engaged quite a bit also into mapping the laws and regulations. So who are we as Philea? We are one strong voice of European philanthropy in Europe, and we want to harness the immense potential of European philanthropy. I lead the policy enable team, and we work towards an enabling operating environment for European philanthropy. We are currently a team of 3. I have 2 colleagues, Hannah Hanses and Lucia Plantamura, and we also want to position philanthropy as a key actor on societal issues, and then also promoting and enabling space for philanthropy. We are guided by a legal affairs committee, which is co-chaired by Isabel Peñalosa and Ludwig Forrest. Isabel Peñalosa is also here on our call today. And it's a combination of foundation representatives as well as representatives from the national associations of foundations. And together they co-lead the Philea work around promoting and enabling space for philanthropy. We do this by monitoring, analyzing, and also engaging around policy developments. We issue weekly monitorings, quarterly newsletters, and also country profiles and comparative highlights, which I want to present a little bit in more detail today. We monitor carefully also national developments and European and international developments that have an impact on the operating space of philanthropy in Europe. We also engage with academics, ERNOP and ISTR, as well as ELI, the European Law Institute, and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. We also have open source information and believe that this is very important also for the research community to use it. So we work with around 40 national country experts who are crafting detailed country profiles, and based on that, we have also put together comparative highlights. And it's the 5th edition that we have published in end 2021 and beginning of 2022 as a printed version. The methodology for our mapping, legal mapping, is developed by an advisory committee composed of academic experts who crafted a questionnaire and also supported the detailed analysis of the comparative highlights. And we then have decided to join forces with the findings of the Lilly Family School Index to compose a joint picture and cross-check trends that we have identified. We are this year also putting together a collection of case studies, concrete case studies of how philanthropic actors and organizations are experiencing barriers to cross-border philanthropy in Europe, and that publication should be issued by the end of the year. And we're also joining this year a project on enterprise foundations as an observer. What does then the publication of the comparative highlights cover? So they really cover how European philanthropy and foundations are regulated, focusing on the legal and fiscal aspects. The comparative highlights include 33 comparative charts, and I encourage you to take a deeper look into the publication yourself. It lists the requirements to establish a foundation, what purposes foundations can pursue, details on governance requirements, and also on rules on operations reporting, as well as supervision existing at the national level. What forms of tax incentives are included for both organized philanthropy foundations as well as for giving. And we also took a closer look in terms of the impact of money laundering and terrorism financing legislation, since this was listed as one of the drivers behind some of the shrinking of space that also Pamela referred to in a European and global context. Key findings, I would like to briefly highlight them here, is that what we have observed is that the laws often are not really keeping up to the desire of a constantly evolving toolbox of actions. So foundations and funders, they would like to also move more towards impact investing, mission-related investing, and different ways of working, also using the endowment in different ways to create more impact. And there we identified that the laws sometimes are a bit restrictive when it gets to these type of new activities that foundations want to embark on. We have, however, also observed positive trends that with regard to the requirements of minimum capital, the laws seem to have been more flexible. So there are some positive trends that we have seen. We've also seen more discussions at the national level in terms of external supervision by public authorities to be potentially also coexisting and sometimes even replaced by self-regulatory mechanisms. So that's a debate that we see happening at a European context. However, we also see that overregulation seems to be an issue in some countries, and we have also identified that in a European context, also within the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU, we remain to have barriers around cross-border philanthropy. And let me briefly just highlight quickly the barriers that we identified. So it is not for granted that the recognition of a legal personality of a foundation is accepted. Sometimes foundations are required to register before they are recognized and can enter into contracts. Then moving the seat and emerging across border is not possible for public benefit foundations, where it is for companies. Also, there's still issues related to discrimination of foreign-based public benefit organizations and their donors with regards to taxation. We have also seen more or tighter registration and reporting issues, mainly also related to the security agenda being introduced, and sometimes unclear wording of some of the international or European policies with regard to beneficial ownership policy in particular. We've unfortunately also seen specific rules on foreign funding restrictions introduced in Hungary. They were withdrawn thanks to also an infringement procedure launched at the EU level. But we also see that new laws are in the pipeline with regard to this. We also see that some countries have been a bit restrictive when it gets to political activities of foundations, and that's a space that we also carefully monitor. Finally, there has also been alarming reports of banks becoming more risk-averse and de-risking parts of our sector. So our members or also their grantees have difficulties in finding access to formal banking channels. So banks are sometimes not willing to transfer funds across border or consider that certain types of activities are too risky. And all the barriers that I described have also unfortunately led to a bit of self-censorship in the sector, and actions potentially not being pursued because also the philanthropic actors themselves are then refraining from doing that. With the joint briefing, we wanted to, together with the Lilly School, identify also how the European trends that we identified fit into the global context, but also how some of the sociological and political environments influence the space. It's something that we do not cover in our Philea legal mappings, which are really concentrated on describing the laws. And with regard to the attitude of governments, we identified together with the Lilly Family School that there seems to be, in a comparison to global level, still a relatively positive attitude towards philanthropy. So that might be encouraging for all of us. But as I said earlier, the existing laws are sometimes too restrictive and not keeping up to new trends, and additional barriers that I also mentioned keep on blocking the space, and unfortunately more have been introduced over the past years. We also sense that there's more willingness with the philanthropic sector to collaborate within the philanthropic sector, but also with other sectors. So there's more desire to collaborate also with the business sector as well as with the public sector. And we've been interested in interesting developments also of co-granting, co-funding with public actors. Overall, also our collaboration with the Indiana University's Lilly Family School Index made us conclude that there is a relatively stable economic and social environment for philanthropy in a European context. But as Sevda outlined, we need to see, since the mapping covered the period from 2018 to 2020, whether and how also the war in Ukraine and other current transitions and the energy crisis will impact on our space from that perspective. And let me conclude with this slide, which points to our European Philanthropy Manifesto, which are our 4 key policy recommendations towards the policymakers. We have been drawing from our mappings and our collaboration with the Lilly Family School to confirm that there are still issues to be solved in terms of recognition of our sector, in terms of facilitating cross-border philanthropy, to enable and protect philanthropy, and also to co-grant and co-invest for public good with public actors and other actors. And new tools should be explored to both protect and expand the operating space for our sector. We are currently updating this European Philanthropy Manifesto and will be soon launching another round of public consultation for you to also be able to provide input on our update of this manifesto. And we're doing this well on time before the European elections to happen next year. And we aim to launch it at our annual flagship event, Europhilantopics, to happen on the 29th of November in Brussels, where we want to engage with policymakers around our policy ask, but also exploring how the European philanthropy sector can collaborate to work towards a society that works for people and the planet with EU policymakers. And I'll hand over back to Sevda for the continuation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hanna Surmaz, for this insightful presentation. So we understand that despite the stable socio-cultural environment, barriers continue to burden the operating of philanthropic organizations and donors. So we have heard the main findings of 2 studies, their methodologies, how they complement one another. Now I would like to invite country experts who contributed to both studies to comment on data, how it can be used as they are able to zoom in and out to see the pieces of puzzle coming together. So, dear Dr. Oonagh Breen, Dr. Isabel Peñalosa, and Julia Kurchenska, in your view, how might the insights from this data potentially impact the work of practitioners and policy formulation in the philanthropic sector? So does data allow for comparison with other regions or countries? And if it's so, what lessons or best practices can be drawn from these comparisons? Over to you, Oonagh.
Thank you very much, Sevda, and thank you for the opportunity to join this great panel. It's always lovely to sit down with European and international colleagues and to talk about these important issues. This data is immensely valuable because it gives us a bird's eye view on many national and regional philanthropic environments. And it's really only when you have that rich level of data that you can begin to see the wood for the trees, so to speak, and you start to identify patterns of behavior or attitudes or trends in regulation. Now, the data assists us in 2 very important ways at 2 different levels. Firstly, it enables macro level comparisons. So we can say global versus European versus sub-regional. Secondly, it gives us very rich micro level analysis on a country by country basis. So 2 very quick points on that before I hand over. At a macro level, the ability to break out the regional data allows us to confirm or challenge our assumptions and question our understandings of what we think we know about philanthropy. So if we're taking the GPEI scores that Pamela spoke to earlier, it's really interesting to note that in each of the areas, the 6 areas she touched on, the EU average is higher than the global average score. Now, before we become really complacent and think that we're great over here all together, when you go down to the sub-regional levels and we dig deeper into the figures, we see that the actual average scores in Central Europe, in Southern Europe, and in the Balkan countries are much lower across those areas we spoke about: economic environment, socio and cultural environment, and political environment. So we obviously have work to do in those areas if we want it to be a rising tide of philanthropy for everybody. Turning very briefly to the micro level, and I find this absolutely fascinating, and this is where the country level data really comes into its own in the Philea country reports. To take one simple example, if you look at the national tax incentives for philanthropy among the 27 EU member states, we see that only 2 countries, Ireland and Slovakia, fail to provide charitable donors with a tax deduction or a tax credit for charitable donations. If you look at Europe more broadly, which brings in 13 additional countries, only Turkey doesn't offer a similar tax deduction. Now, having that type of information enables researchers to begin to investigate, why is this the case? And it also is important for policymakers because it prompts policymakers to think about, do you want to be the outlier in this regard? Particularly, is it in a state's interest? If you want to, and you say you're encouraging philanthropy in your country to be so different from others, can you justify that difference? So it's really, really useful data. So thank you for the opportunity to look at it in more detail.
Thank you. And Dr. Isabel Peñalosa, can you come in?
Thank you, and good morning from Spain, from also rainy Spain. So we are happy with the rain right now. Well, I would say, well, first, thank you to Lilly Family School, and also to Philea for organizing this. I'm happy to be here with these excellent colleagues. I think that the index and the comparative highlights report, they have had a positive impact themselves. I mean, or I explain. It's not just the ranking or the score or where our country is or before or behind who, but is to make policymakers aware that their decisions and what they do influence a lot the landscape of philanthropy in our country. We don't have similar studies here in Spain for philanthropy. Maybe we have more around civil society, but not in this concrete file of philanthropy. And it's not also a matter of comparison, that it is also, I mean, when we talk to, or we advocate and we talk to officials or political representatives, we use this index, in fact, and we use comparative highlights, for example, from Philea, which is appreciated by authorities, are mainly by authorities, okay? But what is interesting also is that this, for example, the Lilly Family School Index, it has include something like social or cultural perception, which is really, really important. I mean, we can talk later maybe around on how we feel we are a score or not in Spain, but it's not a matter of legislation or regulation or some regulation trends that are in all the countries and that are a trend, as Hannah has said, but is also to incorporate some indicators that in Spain are not especially high. I mean, and I would say like social and cultural perception is one of our tasks, and as a Spanish association, one of our main goals is to improve the perception of philanthropy. So in this sense, this helps very much. Okay, I will stop here to hand on to Julia.
I think that reading these reports, it's like going to the doctor for a regular health checkup. And I think it's great to learn, you know, where your health stands, what's your problems, and how to fix it. For us, it was a wake-up call because it was clear that Poland is sliding down the ranking. And my organization, Polish Donors Forum, we ask in my organization, we ask ourselves a question: what we're gonna do with this information? And the answer was easy. We're gonna do our best to climb to the level to the Western European countries that we look up to. And it was one of the reasons why we created manifesto and recommendations for better regulations for foundations. We were very much inspired by Philea, and thank you very much for your support with this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we in fact started to talk a little bit about country context, how this data can be used to contribute to resolving critical issues or challenges faced by philanthropic sector. But maybe the only speaker who didn't comment on this, Oonagh, do you have anything to say related to how this data can be used at the country level? Oonagh, we can't hear you, or maybe you're muted. Yeah, you're still muted.
A double click, which resulted in me muting and unmuting and muting. Turning to Ireland in the regard to how is this data so important for resolving critical issues? Well, it's exceptionally important from an Irish context, because in Ireland, we're currently engaged in a really interesting exercise, Sevda, which is being led by a government department which has responsibility for charity regulation in Ireland, but also for philanthropic development and stronger incentivization of philanthropy. And that's the Department of Rural and Community Development. And it's leading a whole of government approach to develop a national policy on philanthropy. And I'm really excited by this because as far as I can see, it's an unparalleled exercise. I went out to European colleagues, I went out to international colleagues when we started this project in 2021. And I said, can you share with me your national policy on philanthropy? And guess how many I got back? None. So Rwanda had a strategy. I had to go to Africa to get a strategy from a government level on philanthropy. Australia at the moment are carrying out an inquiry into philanthropy, and we hope that that will come forth with recommendations that will lead to Australia doing something. But we're trying something different here in Ireland at the moment. Now, I'm very privileged to sit on the Minister's National Advisory Group in the development of this policy. Indeed, along with another of my co-panelists today, Hannah Surmatz, is bringing that European perspective on behalf of Philea to that group. And to be able to sit at the table and to sit on the subcommittees and to feed into the plenary sessions and to bring this empirical comparative data to the table where the decisions are being made is really, really critical to a good understanding. The draft policy was published by the department in May. It was available for public consultation. You can download it online if you're interested to see what Ireland is thinking. And we are really hopeful that the work that we bring in terms of that comparative analysis is beginning to land in domestic policy. And if you look at the policy, you'll see it covers research and data, which is very important for us. It covers stimulation of philanthropy, the incentives that I talked about earlier. And each of those two sections recognize the critical contribution of knowing what you're talking about. You've got to have good data. We learn from others. We learn what to do. We learn what not to do, which is equally important. And that's why I'm so excited to have good empirical data that can inform policymaking. So I'll hold it there just to try and keep us to time, Sevda.
Yes, we cannot stress it enough. You have to have good data for evidence-based policy, and these resources provide us with that. That's very helpful. So I have one last question regarding your recommendations. So in the light of this data, what are the potential future directions or areas of focus for researchers, practitioners, or policymakers in our region? Would you have any recommendations to future data gatherings of this kind of presentation of this data? So let's this time start with Isabel.
Well, okay, it's not easy question. I would, well, in terms of recommendations, I think that we can find different recommendations for practitioners, academics, or policymakers. I think that we are playing in different levels. For us, one of the very, very concrete recommendations for policymakers and concrete ministers have been how important are the bureaucratic process to register and to set up, for example, foundations. This is something that we were not asking for. I mean, we were used to live with it because we think that is a matter of administrative culture or something like that. But for example, these reports have helped us very much to make them aware that this is very simple, but at the same time very important. It's not only a matter of fiscal regulations, for example. And other recommendations, I mean, are not exactly recommendations, but we need to think a lot on it as a Spanish society, I would say, regarding, as I'm insisting very much in that, but I think it's very important, the social perception, or how we feel, how we know, or how we, and then how we protect philanthropy and individuals taking part in the general interest activities. So I will conclude that we have different recommendations for different levels, for different target groups, but we have had some concrete recommendations that have came out from these two reports, Comparative Highlights and Lilly Family School Index for Philanthropy.
Thank you. Julia, do you have any recommendations?
I don't have any recommendation, but if I had a wish list, I would desire to have more financial information, more data, especially on transnational giving or international help for disasters or conflict, like help to Ukraine. I give it as an example, but I think having financial data would be very useful in advocacy work, both on national and European level, and it would be great to showcase how philanthropy is important.
Excellent, thank you. And Oonagh?
A very quick recommendation, Sevda. When I think about recommendations on future data gatherings, which is what you're asking me to focus on, I think from a researcher's perspective, a guarantee for us that you will have these reports continuously on a periodic basis so that we can rely on this information coming out every couple of years and we can build upon what you're doing, and also to have consistency where possible between those periodic reports, because from a research perspective, we want to compare apples with apples, not apples with oranges. Now, I know sometimes we tweak questions or there's a shift, methodological shift for particular reasons, but where possible to be both continuous and to be consistent. In the same way that we rely on national census data from a domestic planning perspective, we need a similar level of data capture in terms of both philanthropic regulatory regimes and also the operating environments for philanthropy. So there's great value in both the Lilly School report and the Philea report. There's great complementarity between them. So we need you both to keep doing what you're doing and to keep talking to each other.
Thank you so much, three of you, for your insightful contributions. Now I would like to invite Pamela Wipkin once again for closing remarks. You have heard the recommendations, so feel free to comment on the future directions of research or any other concluding thoughts.
Thank you so much, Sevda, and thank you, Oonagh, Isabel, and Julia, for your really insightful remarks on how these resources can be relevant for people to use across Europe, but also in other parts of the world. I think that it is important that we get the word out that these resources are there. And this webinar, of course, is a great example of how we're trying to do it, but any help anyone else can give in sharing these resources to wider audiences and letting people know these resources are there, I think is really important. We are very fortunate in Europe to have some really good data resources. Other parts of the world don't have that. And the thing that is limiting philanthropy and philanthropy research and philanthropy advising and policy advising is often the lack of reliable and high quality data to better understand what is the current status in a country and how can we help to improve that status so that philanthropy can make that contribution to the public good in a way that it is meaningful and helpful to everyone and not just a select few people, which philanthropy often has a risk of focusing on. So oftentimes in philanthropy, there is a lot of what I would call, in line with Putnam, bonding social capital. So we would be focusing on a lot of the people that look like us and that are similar to us, but the bridging capital that philanthropy can provide and should provide is often lacking, and much more information is needing to better understand it and to help overcome these issues. I also think what is really important that we also saw today is that the importance of infrastructure and infrastructure organizations like Philea, but also Oonagh, the European Research Network on Philanthropy, and WINGS. But the funding for those types of organizations is often really challenging and they're typically underfunded. But if we don't have those infrastructure organizations, we will not be able to successfully work towards a more common agenda in philanthropy. So I think funding for infrastructure organizations and the work infrastructure organizations do is of utmost importance and needs a lot of attention. So I will keep it at that.
Thank you so much. This is the end of the webinar. As we conclude this webinar, we would like to extend our sincere gratitude to all panelists, attendees, and our co-host, Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and Philea. We hope the insights and discussions today have gave you some inspiration about how to use this data for your policy efforts or anything other activities. Thank you so much.